A while back, we did a video on the worst mechanic of each generation. Getting straight to it, today we're going to go over what we believe to be the best mechanic of each generation. Possibly more than one for some generations, since it can be hard to nail down just one single thing, as there are always a lot of significant changes and additions to mechanics in every game that people will want to point out. Anyway, I'll keep this intro briefer than usual, otherwise we're just gonna have the same intro as the worst mechanics video. So, with that, Miss Magius, Pokemon Crystal Clear, and Wind Waker HD Let's Play, link in the description below. But with that, let's get right to business. Starting off with red, blue, and yellow, well, this may be the hardest to pick of them all, since every mechanic is technically a new mechanic, and everything from catching Pokemon to the most basic move mechanics is an obvious contender here. So instead of leaning into the obvious stuff, let's try to highlight something more niche. Now, for me personally, while not actually outright niche, I actually do like the fact that psychic types are insanely powerful. And while I don't think it was fully intentional for them to be as dominant as they were, it's pretty clear it was meant to be intimidating. The two best legendaries were psychic types, in Mew and Mewtwo. And it was even stated that in Generation 2, they decided to make Lugia a psychic type instead of a water to give it a stronger impression. So I don't think it's entirely conjecture to think that they intended on the psychic typing to feel like a big deal back in Generation 1 on purpose, even if the balance did get a bit carried away. However, I know that's not something everyone is going to like. My editor actually had a different pick for mine, which was how powerful normal was. In particular, how Hyper Beam didn't need to recharge if it caused the enemy to faint. It would have been interesting if some normal types would have been able to keep this in following generations. It still would have been a nerf, since other typings wouldn't be able to use it in that way. But it would have kept Pokemon like Tauros more relevant in competitive tiers in future generations, and even normal playthroughs. It also could have led to some interesting NPC battles and playthroughs if they chose to abuse the mechanic. Another mechanic that was good in some ways was speed increasing crit, which could have gotten more out of hand later on. But in Gen 1, it does help certain Pokemon be more viable, like Persian. So obviously, we've got a couple of battle-related mechanics here that we decided to point out. And while some of them are a double-edged sword, I think they were mostly pretty fun in the original games, even if some of them were better off not making it in the future generations. Otherwise, because this series was brand new, almost any basic mechanic could be labeled as one of the best it introduced. Moving on to Gen 2, it still feels pretty difficult to nail down a single mechanic as the best. It was also a monumental release for the series, introducing a ton of new mechanics and features that we take for granted now. It's easy to forget that stuff like weather, held items, shinies, and breeding came from these games. In fact, breeding itself could be a candidate for the best mechanic, and definitely adds a much needed extra detail to the daycares in these games, as it felt a bit plain in Gen 1. There's also the Pokegear, which added some nice flavor to the world, though some of the phone calls you can get are a bit mundane or silly. There's also the passing of time and the days of the week, which at the time when the game came out was mind-blowing on a Game Boy game. Actually, it's still pretty crazy to see it on a game for such an old portable system. But to pick just one, maybe the addition of the Steel and Dark types. This did great things for the game balance, in particular making fire and fighting types more desirable. Fire types as a whole weren't truly great just yet in Gen 2 despite this, but they were leagues above their mediocrity in Gen 1 partly thanks to this. The same goes for fighting types, and would be even better in Generation 2 already if more of them could get better fighting stab moves, like Heracross for example. Both types also put more of a leash on the very powerful Psychic type. The only thing I don't like is that Steel made it a bit harder for the normal type, which already had other nerfs like Hyper Beam. Then again, that didn't stop Snorlax from being the top terror in GSC anyway. The addition of these two types were also so cool aesthetically, introducing Pokemon like Steelix, Houndoom, and, you know, Umbreon. With Gen 3, I think this one is pretty easy. Abilities. Generation 3 was kind of like a reboot of the games, especially mechanically, to the point where you couldn't transfer Pokemon from previous entries. Abilities, especially when you're playing these games for the first time, really keep you on your toes. You could never immediately tell everything a Pokemon was capable of. Suddenly, Vaporeon could just get swapped in and heal up when you're about to use a water attack thanks to Water Absorb, for example. There was now more to think about, and more opportunities for Pokemon to be a lot better and fun to use if they were given an ability that enhanced them in the right way. For an honorable mention, maybe the Battle Frontier introduced in Emerald. But it's not for everyone, and doesn't qualify as much as a mechanic as much as the introduction of abilities. For Gen 4, it's another one that's pretty easy for me. We immediately decided on the physical special split. While this wasn't great for every Pokemon, it generally made the move options feel way better. Finally, a Pokemon like Gyarados could use Water Stab while taking advantage of its physical attack. It just felt way better to see that the moves were a bit more nuanced and that certain typings weren't just restricted to only being one of either special or physical. Now, we could have physical fire moves. With all the mechanical changes that happened in Gen 3, it's crazy to think this change didn't happen until Diamond and Pearl. The other things to like are, once again, less like mechanics and more like features. The online features were a massive game changer, really solidifying yet another new era for the series. And we got the day/night features back, which went missing in Gen 3. At first, I had no idea what to pick for Gen 5. The impact of Black and White, overall, I'd say is less about new mechanics and features, and more about things like the narrative and overall style and substance of certain things. There are definitely mechanics to talk about, like permanent weather, but I wouldn't call them the best mechanic, even if I did love going crazy with that strat with Politoed back in the day. But I think I've settled on a change in Gen 5 that I think we all thought was an improvement for the series by this point: unbreakable TMs. It's easy to forget sometimes that this is where they decided to lighten up on how TMs were handled. Even HMs weren't as bad as the previous 3 games, and most of them weren't even needed to beat the game. It definitely made making ideal movesets for your Pokemon all around less excruciating. These picks have only gotten easier, because the best mechanic for Gen 6 is, what do you think? How could it not be Mega Evolutions? It felt like everybody won with this mechanic. You only care about single player stuff? Mega Evolutions are cool. You like Pokemon beyond the games? You like the anime and are a general fan of Pokemon designs and stuff? Mega Evolutions are dope. Do you like battling other players? Competitive metas? Mega Evolutions are cool. The fact that it's been gone for 2 generations now has really made clear just how much we took it for granted. It wasn't perfect, and I'm not sure if most of the legendaries and pseudos that had access to it really needed it over other mods. But I gotta say, it was pretty cool and spiced up some Pokemon that really needed it gameplay-wise. I'm not sure if every type of Pokemon game really needs this mechanic or anything like that, because everything does get stale eventually. But this one was a real hit, and it makes X and Y feel a little bit more special than it did before in hindsight. Gen 7 is more about a removal of a mechanic being the best thing. That is, the removal of HMs. The moves are still around, but no more clogging up your movesets with things like cut in order to beat the game. The mechanic wasn't totally removed to be technical here, but rather replaced by Pokemon Ride. Removing it fully maybe wasn't entirely the best way to go about it, as I do like the puzzle aspect of needing certain types of Pokemon in order to do certain things. It's just the restrictions and move slots that were so awful. But even if I don't think the handling of the situation was perfect, it still felt damn good to not have to deal with it, especially after ORAS barely held back with the HM problems from the original Hoenn games. For Gen 8, I'm gonna stick to Sword and Shield for this, since the other Gen 8 games are actually quite different in several ways, especially Legends Arceus. I would argue that the best part of this gen is the existence of Legends Arceus, in fact. But it does function a bit too differently from your typical core game in the series for me to want to point out a feature as the best of the whole generation. Anyway, both Sword and Shield and Gen 9 are less cut and dry to pick a best and worst mechanic of. But I think I have a simple one for Sword and Shield. It's not a major feature or mechanic in a broad sense, but rather an item that made the game more enjoyable competitively. That item being the heavy-duty boots. It's not a flashy item at all, but being able to overcome hazards is seriously awesome for a lot of Pokemon, and open up a lot more viable strategies for many fan-favorite Pokemon that definitely deserve to be used in more matchups. No more Charizard getting destroyed immediately thanks to Stealth Rock. Having access to a Mega would have been better, but hey, I think the impact this item has had on the game at least deserves some respect. And lastly, for Scarlet and Violet, I have to admit, I like Terras. It's not nearly as special as Megas, but I do like strategizing with it and deciding which Pokemon should use which Terra typing, albeit more from a casual point of view than a super hardcore competitive one. I'm aware that in tiers like National Dex, Terras are not liked, and I'm not entirely sure how this mechanic will be seen down the line overall when Gen 9 is done with, as it's not nearly as memorable as previous major mechanics. But personally, I've been pretty cool with it. My only noteworthy issue with it would be the visuals. It doesn't look bad on every Pokemon, but visually, some of the aesthetics of it could have been a lot better. But ultimately, Terras are still my pick for Gen 9, even if it feels like a safe choice. As I said before, these last two generations are a bit tricky to choose a single major thing for. And with Terras, there isn't too much I can say here about the current gen main mechanic that you haven't been hearing in hundreds of other Pokemon videos. So let's just wrap it up here. And those are our picks for the best mechanics of each generation. What did you guys think? Did you guys agree with these picks? What are your choices for the best mechanics of each game? And if you didn't comment on it last time, what about the worst mechanics? Let me know your thoughts down below. I also want to say I won't be as active on the channel from now until around the 10th of January, but there will still be content up in the meantime. Now since holidays are over, we will be transitioning back to less uploads weekly, but there will still be content coming out. Regardless, thanks so much for tuning in this holiday season, and I hope you all have a great new year.